Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into a hugely important book, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring.
Yeah, absolutely pivotal.
We're aiming to give you a kind of express route to understanding it. This book just fundamentally changed how we look at the environment, didn't it? And, our own actions.
It really did. And what's so interesting is that Carson wasn't some unknown figure. She was already a very well-respected science writer. People knew her for these beautiful books about the ocean.
Right, the Sea Trilogy, very famous.
Exactly. So when she suddenly pivots to pesticides, this seemingly quite niche topic, it definitely made people sit up and take notice. It gave her arguments real weight.
And she had government experience, too.
Yes, she'd worked inside the system. She and her colleagues, they'd seen firsthand this growing reliance on chemicals like DDT, especially after World War II. And even back then, some concerns were bubbling up about how long they lasted, what they might, actually do.
Okay, so let's frame our mission here. We want to pull out Carson's core arguments, look at the evidence she brought together, and importantly, understand why it hit so hard, especially considering, what science knew back then.
Right.
And for you listening, if you want to get up to speed on big ideas quickly, that's what we're here for, to kind of boil it down.
And it's important to remember, this wasn't easy for her. She faced, a lot of pushback right from the start.
Even with her reputation.
Oh, yeah. Getting magazines to publish articles about pesticide dangers, really tough. Publishers were worried, understandably perhaps, about losing ad revenue, from the big chemical companies, agricultural groups.
There was that story about a baby food company.
That's right, a classic example. Worried about causing unwarranted fear among mothers if magazines ran stories like hers. It really shows the pressure she was under.
So that resistance, it actually pushed her towards writing a book instead.
Exactly. It kind of forced her hand. A book publisher was maybe a little less vulnerable to that direct advertising heat. Though, interestingly, the New Yorker did eventually serialize parts of Silent Spring. That was a big deal.
But think about the commitment. 4 years, you said?
Over 4 years.
Huh.
And it was a different kind of work for her. Not like the sort of joyful exploration of her ocean writing. This felt more like a duty, almost.
Yeah.
A heavy responsibility to get this information out there.
And it took a personal toll, too, didn't it?
Absolutely. We have to acknowledge that. During those last intense years writing, she was really struggling with her health. She called it a catalog of illnesses.
Wow.
But her dedication, that sense of duty, it just kept her going.
Incredible. Okay, so let's get to the core. That title, Silent Spring, it's so evocative. What did that silent landscape actually look and sound like in her writing?
She paints this really chilling picture. A world where the usual sounds of nature have just vanished, especially birdsong. That lack of the dawn chorus,
Yeah, something you almost take for granted until it's gone.
Precisely. People noticed their bird feeders were empty. The birds they did see were acting strangely trembling, unable to fly properly. She lists specific birds, robins, catbirds, doves, jays, wrens, all these familiar voices just gone silent. In the fields, the woods, the marshes.
And it wasn't just the birds, was it? The silence was bigger than that.
Oh, much bigger. Her Silent Spring was about a whole system starting to fail. On farms, hens weren't hatching chicks. Farmers were having trouble raising young pigs, couldn't figure out why. Apple trees would bloom, look beautiful, but then no fruit. Because the bees needed for pollination, they were gone too.
Wow, the pollinators.
Crucial, absolutely crucial. And even the roadsides, usually buzzing with life, wildflowers, they were just lined with dead, withered plants. The streams too. No fish, no anglers bothering to go there anymore. Lifeless.
That's a powerful, bleak image. And she linked this directly to pesticides, right? This escalating chemical war, she called it. What did she mean by that?
It was about this dangerous cycle. See, initially chemicals like DDT seemed like miracle weapons against insects.
Yeah, wonder drugs of a sort.
Right. But then biology kicked in. Natural selection, Darwin's survival of the fittest. The insects that happened to have some slight genetic resistance, they survived the spraying.
And pass that resistance on.
Exactly. They reproduce, and the next generation is tougher. So what happens? You need stronger poisons, more toxic chemicals to get the same result.
A chemical arms race, essentially.
That's a good way to put it. And then there was this other thing she called flare back. You'd spray, kill off a lot of the target pest, but also their natural enemies, and then the pest population could explode, sometimes even worse than before.
So you're trapped in this cycle of needing more and more chemicals.
Precisely. A truly vicious cycle. It just demanded constant, escalating intervention.
And her main point about all this was?
It was a stark warning. She said our whole approach to insect control had to be based on, well, reality, ecological reality. Not just wishful thinking about wiping out pests. The methods were so broad, so indiscriminate, they were threatening to destroy everything, including us, along with the insects.
Which makes you think about the insect problem itself. She suggested our own practices had kind of made it worse, didn't she?
She did. She acknowledged, look, insects have always competed with us for food,
Yeah.
spread diseases. That's true.
Sure.
But the scale of the problem in her time, she argued it was amplified by modern life, like planting huge monocultures. Think of streets lined only with elm trees.
Ah, setting them up for disaster.
Right. Perfect conditions for something like Dutch elm disease spread by beetles to just sweep through. If you had a mix of trees, it wouldn't spread so easily, much less catastrophic.
And invasive species played a big part, too.
A huge part. She talked about Charles Elton's work, The Ecology of Invasions, how continents were separated for ages, like these colossal separate nature reserves, letting unique species evolve.
Okay.
But then, through human travel and trade mostly, these barriers broke down. Species started moving into places they'd never been before.
And why do they often become such big pests in new places?
Usually because they're natural enemies. The predators, the parasites, the diseases that kept them in check back home, they're not there in the new place.
So their populations can just explode.
Exactly. No natural controls. And Carson's point was, we jump to these simple chemical fixes without really looking at the ripple effects. What does this stuff do to the soil, to water, to wildlife, to us?
That brings us to that really chilling chapter title, Elixirs of Death. What was the core message there about how pervasive these chemicals had become?
The core message was just staggering, really. For the first time ever, she said, every single human being, from conception to death, was being exposed to these dangerous chemicals, whether they wanted to be or not.
Involuntarily.
Totally. She stressed how quickly these new synthetic pesticides had spread everywhere, through the whole environment, living things, non-living things, just everywhere.
And where were they finding them?
Pretty much anywhere they looked, in major rivers, in groundwater, deep in the soil where they'd stick around for years.
Yes.
Oh, yes. In fish, from remote mountain lakes, in earthworms, in bird eggs, and really disturbingly, in human bodies, stored in our fat, present in mother's milk, passed on to infants, likely even reaching unborn babies.
That's terrifying. And this was all because of the rise of synthetic insecticides.
Directly. She called the industry a child of the Second World War, which is fascinating.
How so?
Well, during the war, there was intense research into chemical weapons, and they discovered some lab-made chemicals were incredibly toxic, not just to people, but also to insects. Insects were actually used to test the lethality for humans sometimes.
Grim.
Very. But that research basically paved the way for the post-war boom in synthetic pesticides.
How are these different from what people used before the war?
Before the war, insecticides were mostly, natural things, minerals like arsenic, copper compounds, or plant extracts, pyrethrum from chrysanthemums, nicotine from tobacco, rotenone from certain legumes.
Things found in nature.
Right. But these new synthetic ones, entirely man-made, chemists figuring out how to swap atoms around, change molecular structures, create totally new poisons in the lab.
Though she still talked about some of the older poisons too, like arsenic. It sounds like that one had a pretty bad track record already.
Oh, definitely. Even with all the focus on the new synthetics, she made sure to point out that stuff like arsenic was still being used. In weed killers, some insecticides, and yeah, its history is grim. Homicides, obviously. Recognized as a carcinogen in chimney soot way back.
Right.
Plus tons of cases of poisoning in people, livestock eating contaminated grass, devastating effects on bees. She quoted Dr. Huper from the National Cancer Institute talking about the utter disregard for health and how arsenicals were handled. Just supreme carelessness. The fact that beekeeping declined massively in cotton areas using arsenic sprays, that was a huge red flag.
Okay, let's dig into the chemistry of trouble, as she called it. Specifically, the chlorinated hydrocarbons. What are those, fundamentally?
So carbon is the backbone of life, right? Its atoms can link up in endless ways, chains, rings, bonding with other elements. That's what creates the amazing diversity of life, of proteins, fats, vitamins, all based on carbon.
Okay, makes sense.
But carbon's also in non-living things. Now, chlorinated just means chemists figured out how to stick chlorine atoms onto these carbon-based molecules, replacing some of the usual hydrogen atoms.
That changes things.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
She used simple examples like methane. Swap some hydrogens for chlorine, you get chloroform, the anesthetic. Swap all four, you get carbon tetrachloride, a cleaning fluid. Even small changes create totally different substances, often with powerful, unexpected effects. And it's much more complex than just that the shape of the molecule, other chemical groups attach it. It all matters. Chemists got really good at making incredibly potent poisons this way.
And DDT was the classic example. How did she say it worked once it got inside us?
She laid it out clearly. You could eat it in contaminated food, absorb it through your skin, especially if it was mixed with oil, which it often was, or breathe it in during spraying.
Multiple routes in.
Right. And because it dissolves in fat, it doesn't just pass through. It builds up, gets stored in fatty tissues. That includes important organs like the adrenals, testes, thyroid, also the liver, kidneys, and the fat around your intestines.
It concentrates.
Hugely. That's bioaccumulation or biological magnification. She explained how even tiny amounts in your diet, say 1 part per million, could lead to levels 10, 15 times higher, or even more, stored in your body fat over time.
That sounds like a lot, even starting from a small amount. What could those stored levels actually do?
Well, based on animal studies back then, she reported that levels as low as 3 parts per million could mess with a key enzyme in heart muscle. 5 parts per million showed liver cell damage.
That's not much at all.
No. And similar effects were seen with related chemicals like dieldrin and chlordane at even lower levels, like 2.5 ppm. Then she connected it to humans. Studies showed the average person was already storing DDT levels that were potentially in that risky range.
Just from food.
Primarily, yeah. And people with more exposure, farm workers, factory workers, making the stuff, they had way higher levels, hundreds of parts per million sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
She basically said, look, even the minimum levels we're seeing in everybody are already above where we see organ damage start in animals.
And she covered others too. Chlordane, heptachlor, aldrin, dieldrin, endrin. Any key things about those?
With chlordane, she stressed how long it lasts in the environment, and again, multiple ways to get exposed, and it builds up cumulatively. Heptachlor was bad because it's stored really well in fat, and it could transform into something called heptachlor epoxide in soil, plants, animals, which was even more toxic, like 4 times as toxic as chlordane.
So it gets worse after it's released.
In that case, yeah. Aldrin was noted because it quickly turned into dieldrin in the body or soil.
Sure.
So if testers were only looking for aldrin, they might miss the danger because it had already converted to the more persistent dieldrin. Very. And endrin was just highlighted for being extremely acutely toxic. She told that awful story of the baby in Venezuela suffering severe, permanent brain damage from just a brief exposure. Just incredibly potent stuff.
Okay, then there was the next group. The organic phosphorus insecticides. How were they different?
Totally different mechanism. These attack the nervous system directly by messing with an enzyme called cholinesterase.
What does that enzyme do?
It's like a reset switch for nerve signals. It breaks down a neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, after a nerve fires. If you inhibit cholinesterase, acetylcholine builds up. Nerves keep firing uncontrollably. Leads to tremors, spasms, convulsions, potentially death from respiratory failure. She noted it was similar to muscarine poisoning from toxic mushrooms.
Sounds incredibly dangerous to handle.
Extremely.
Mm-hmm.
She stressed the risks for workers, needing special precautions, medical backup. Even doctors treating exposure or people washing contaminated clothes were at risk, especially with parathion. And these residues could stick around 2 dangerous levels on sprayed citrus for weeks, detectable in orange peels months later.
And what about herbicides? Weed killers. Were they seen as safer?
Now, that was a myth she wanted to bust. The idea that they only kill plants. Not true. She pointed out many herbicides are toxic to animals too. They worked in different ways. Some were general poisons, some could dangerously speed up metabolism, and some were suspected carcinogens even then.
She used some really powerful case studies. Clear Lake in California sounds like a key example of things going wrong. What happened there?
Clear Lake is just a textbook case of unintended consequences. They wanted to control these little gnats that were annoying people. So they started treating the lake water with chlorinated hydrocarbon insecticides back in the late 40s.
Directly into the lake?
Yep. Started with really low concentrations, seemingly tiny amounts. But the poison didn't stay dilute. It moved up the food chain, getting more and more concentrated each step.
Biological magnification again?
Exactly. And the most obvious victim was the western grebe, a bird that eats fish from the lake. Their population just crashed after each spraying. Later, they found incredibly high levels of DDT and its relative DDD in the grebe's fat, wrecking their reproduction. And even years after they stopped spraying, the chemical was still cycling through the lake's food web.
Just persisted.
For years. Carson used it to ask that fundamental question. Does it make any sense to put these persistent poisons into our water, especially knowing they build up in living things? She also slammed the practice of poisoning reservoirs just to improve fishing, calling it Alice in Wonderland logic, kill everything, then maybe restock while people downstream might be drinking that water.
Another area she focused on, which is often ignored, was the soil. What were her concerns there?
She really wanted people to appreciate the soil as a living community. Teeming with life, incredible numbers of bacteria, fungi, tiny invertebrates, all essential for breaking things down, cycling nutrients, keeping the soil fertile.
The hidden world beneath our feet.
Totally. And her point was everything relies on the soil, and the soil relies on this living community. So what happens when we dump powerful poisons onto it, either directly or washed in by rain?
Yeah, what does happen?
Well, that was the problem nobody really knew for sure or seemed to care much. Could we kill off pests without also killing beneficial insects living in the soil? Or the fungi that help tree roots absorb nutrients? She pointed out there was just very little research into soil ecology in the context of pest control.
Did she have examples of soil contamination causing problems?
Yes. There was benzene hexachloride, BHC, used as a soil insecticide. It got into sweet potatoes, gave them this awful musty taste and smell. Crops rejected. Baby food companies losing money, and heptachlor used in hop fields in the Northwest, meant to kill root weevils, but the hop vines themselves started dying. The chemical stayed in the soil for years, damaging later crops. Eventually, the government had to pull its approval for that use. Just showed how messing with the soil could backfire badly.
Looking at bigger ecosystems, she talked about the sagebrush plains out west. What was the issue there?
She described this beautifully balanced system. The sagebrush itself, the pronghorn antelope, the sage grouse, all depending on each other. Sage provides food and cover. Grouse help disperse grass seeds. Even deer and livestock rely on sage, especially in winter.
Sounds pretty harmonious.
It was. But then land management agencies decided they wanted more grass for cattle. So they started these huge programs to kill off the sagebrush over vast areas, just spray it away.
To create grasslands.
Pure grasslands. But Carson questioned if that was even stable or desirable in a naturally dry region, and the results, predictably bad. Antelope and grouse numbers plummeted. Deer suffered. Even the cattle lost a vital winter food source. It backfired ecologically.
Any specific examples of that destruction?
She used one from Justice William O. Douglas, spraying in the Bridger National Forest. It killed the sage, yes, but also the willows along the streams, which hammered the moose populations, beavers, trouts, waterfowl, basically wrecked a whole recreational area trying to get rid of one plant.
This ties into the And No Birds Sing chapter, right? But focusing more on weed killers.
Exactly. Here she turned to the often thoughtless use of herbicides. Driven by this feeling of power, she said, this giddy sense of power over nature, ignoring the long-term costs.
Like roadside spraying.
Yeah, that was a big target. The economic argument for chemical plowing or spraying roadsides to control brush, she said it completely ignored the real costs. The damage to the landscape, the wildlife, the aesthetics. She told this story about conservationists in Maine being furious about their beautiful roadsides being sprayed bare, potentially hurting tourism.
Was there a better way?
She highlighted Dr. Frank Egler's work on selective spraying for rights-of-way. Instead of blasting everything, you just target the tall, woody plants you actually want to control and leave the shrubs, ferns, wildflowers. It's more stable ecologically, looks better, and can even be cheaper in the long run than repeated blanket spraying.
Makes sense.
She also went after suburban lawn care. All those crabgrass killers. Many contain mercury, arsenic, chlordane, really toxic stuff, applied at incredibly high rates per acre. She pointed out the obvious toll on birds and wondered about the risks to kids and pets playing on those lawns. She even floated the idea of using specific insects to control specific weeds, a more biological approach.
Then there's the direct killing of wildlife from insecticide spraying needless havoc.
Yeah, she put this in historical context. Like the slaughter of the buffalo, the passenger pigeon, this indiscriminate killing of wildlife via pesticides was, for her, just the latest depressing chapter. She really condemned the attitude that wildlife was just expendable in the war against insects.
Assessing the damage must have been hard with conflicting reports.
Definitely. Conservation groups and biologists would report significant losses, while the control agencies and chemical companies often downplayed it. But Carson argued you should trust the wildlife biologist actually on the scene, seeing the effects, more than entomologists just focused on killing the target insect.
What were some examples she gave?
Sheldon, Illinois was a major one. Widespread DDT spraying for Dutch elm disease resulted in massive bird die-offs. Robins were hit hardest, but lots of species suffered. She described birds trembling, convulsing, dying. Horrific.
Pets too.
Yeah, dogs and cats getting sick, suddenly vomiting, diarrhea, convulsions. probably from licking the pesticide off their fur.
Hmm.
And you couldn't just wash this stuff off easily. Plus, the birds that did survive often seemed sterile, no young in the nests. Mammals got hit hard too. Squirrels, muskrats, rabbits practically wiped out in some areas. And those cat deaths in Sheldon. She noted it mirrored cat die-offs in WHO malaria programs using dieldrin elsewhere. Cats seem really sensitive to it.
And the water wasn't spared either. And the streams were still...
Right, the focus shifts to aquatic life.
Yeah.
Fish kills were common after spraying nearby areas, DDT being a frequent culprit. But it wasn't just direct poisoning of fish.
The food chain again.
Exactly. Wiping out aquatic insects, the main food for fish like salmon and trout. And while some small insects might come back relatively quickly, the larger ones fish rely on, caddisflies, stoneflies, mayflies, they took years to recover, if they ever did fully. She mentioned Canada even trying to transplant caddisfly larvae into damaged streams.
Forest spraying must have been a big issue for rivers.
Huge. Spraying forests for things like budworm inevitably contaminated rivers. The Miramichi River salmon fishery in Canada was badly affected. And again, she stressed, spraying isn't the only way to manage forests. Other pesticides too, endrin, toxaphene, dieldrin, heptachlor, were known fish killers. She worried about the future impact on estuaries, those critical coastal nurseries.
That Florida fish kill sounded particularly bad.
The Indian River dieldrin spraying for sandfly larvae, yeah. Catastrophic. A substantially complete kill, she wrote. So many dead fish it attracted sharks, mullets, snook, tiny fish like gambusia just wiped out across miles of river.
And the unseen impacts.
That was her big worry. Pesticides washing into estuaries indirectly from rivers. We knew so little. Then still don't know enough about what chemicals are getting there, how they change in salt water, how they interact with each other. She pleaded for more research funding into this. It was a massive threat to fisheries, and the public needed to wake up and demand change.
She was also really critical of those big aerial spraying campaigns, indiscriminate bombing from the air. What was the main problem there?
Often, it was the sheer scale and questionable justification. She used the gypsy moth and fire ant programs as key examples. Campaigns launched, she argued, based on fear and exaggeration, without really understanding the insect or the consequences of dousing huge areas with poison.
Tell me about the gypsy moth case.
Introduced accidentally in the 19th century. By the 1950s, there were ambitious plans to eradicate it with aerial DDT spraying. Opposition grew, especially after the 1957 Long Island spray program.
What happened there?
They sprayed DDT over heavily populated suburbs, farms, dairies, fish ponds, salt marshes, just blanketed everything. People got sick, pets died, including a racehorse. Wildlife was hit hard. A group of citizens actually sued, which was a big step in raising awareness.
And milk contamination was an issue, too.
Yes, the Waller Farm case in Westchester County. They were assured their farm wouldn't be sprayed directly, but it was. DDT levels in their milk shot up way above legal limits. It highlighted how patchy the regulations were, how little protection consumers actually had. Federal rules were weak. State and local enforcement varied wildly.
Okay, and the fire ant program. The government claimed they were really destructive.
That's what the USDA claimed. But Carson cited scientists in Alabama who found that was mostly hype. Damage to crops was rare, no real harm to livestock. Dr. Arendt said they weren't a major agricultural pest.
Did they have any benefits?
Ironically, yes. They eat other insects, including pests like boll weevil larvae, and their mounds help aerate the soil. As for the human risk, the Alabama State Health Officer said deaths from bites were basically unheard of. Serious reactions were rare. Treating individual mounds seemed like a much better solution than poisoning millions of acres.
But the spraying happened anyway, and the impact.
Oh, it happened, and the impact on wildlife, especially birds, was devastating. Massive die-offs, particularly ground-feeding birds like quail, nearly wiped out in some treated areas. Dead birds tested showed high levels of dieldrin and heptachlor. This happened across the South. Eventually, the program faced huge opposition. Alabama cut funding. Louisiana farmers complained it caused other pests to increase. It basically failed. As one expert said, there were more fire ants after the program than before it started.
All this environmental damage is staggering, but she also focused squarely on the human price. How did she connect pesticides directly to human health?
She started with just the basics, how easy it was to buy incredibly toxic stuff. No warnings, unlike medicines. Cheerful displays in garden centers right where kids could grab them.
Yeah, you still see that sometimes.
Right. And the hazards at home moth-proofing sprays, chlordane used by exterminators. She quoted the FDA's own pharmacologist warning about the very great hazard of living in a chlordane-treated house. And dieldrin, even more toxic, was in household products too. Insecticide-impregnated shelf paper, bug bombs for the kitchen. just casual poison use.
Even personal repellents.
Yeah. She pointed out the irony, warnings saying dissolves paint and plastic, but somehow implying it's fine on human skin. She gave that detailed case study of the Dr. Gardner using DDT and Elatheon weekly, then collapsing. Hospitalized, high DDT in his fat, nerve damage, weakness, real-world consequences.
And contaminated food.
Accidental spills during shipping, storage, but also the whole system of tolerances, the supposedly safe limits set by the FDA. She called it mere paper security because it ignored the reality of multiple exposures. You eat residues on apples, different ones on lettuce, maybe breathe some in, absorb some through skin. It all adds up. The tolerances didn't account for that cumulative burden or how chemicals might interact. Her view was stark. No poison is safe or desirable on food, period.
Did she suggest links to specific diseases, like liver problems?
Yes. She noted rising rates of liver disease and pointed out that chlorinated hydrocarbons were known liver toxins, even at low levels. They could damage the liver directly or maybe just weaken its ability to fight off other diseases.
And the nervous system.
Both the chlorinated hydrocarbons and the organic phosphates hit the nervous system. DDT affects the cerebellum, the motor cortex, causing those tremors, convulsions. But she also highlighted synergy, how one chemical can make another far worse.
How does that work?
Her example was methoxychlor, considered safer than DDT. But if your liver was already compromised, maybe by another pesticide or cleaning fluid, even some drugs your body couldn't process methoxychlor properly. It would build up, store like DDT, and have similar toxic effects. Suddenly, the safe chemical isn't safe at all.
That's a crucial point.
Absolutely. And some organophosphates had delayed effects, like ginger paralysis from a toxic contaminant years before. People exposed to certain pesticide developed paralysis weeks later. The damage wasn't immediate.
And then she ventured into the territory of cancer. That must have been controversial.
Hugely controversial then, and still debated now in some contexts. But she laid out plausible biological mechanisms based on the science of her day. One path involved disrupting how cells produce energy.
Cellular respiration.
Exactly. She drew on Otto Warburg's Nobel Prize-winning work. His theory was that if you damage a cell's ability to use oxygen efficiently damage the mitochondria, it might switch to a more primitive energy system, fermentation. Warburg thought this irreversible switch could be the origin of cancer. And Carson noted that many pesticides were known to interfere with cellular oxidation and energy production.
So pesticides could potentially trigger that switch.
That was the implication she explored. Another potential pathway was direct damage to chromosomes, causing mutations. The mutation theory of cancerous cell gets a genetic error that lets it multiply uncontrollably. Some chemicals were known mutagens.
Any other potential links? Hormones?
Yes, she discussed that too, pointing to findings of high estrogen levels in some cancer patients and the liver's role in breaking down excess estrogen. If pesticides damage the liver, estrogen levels could rise, compounded by exposure to synthetic estrogens in the environment. Also, links to B vitamins liver damage could impair their function, and B vitamin deficiency have been linked to some cancers.
So multiple potential contributing factors.
Right. Not saying pesticides were the only cause, but that they were part of this dangerous chemical soup, this sea of carcinogens we were immersing ourselves in. She ended that section asking a really pointed question. Are we trading cancer risk for trivial things, like a weed-free lawn?
A powerful question. And nature itself was fighting back, wasn't it? That chapter on resistance and resurgence.
Yes, nature fights back.
Yeah.
This was Carson showing evolution in action, a direct consequence of the chemical onslaught. She called insect resistance a clear verification of Darwin's survival of the fittest.
Because the chemicals create the selection pressure.
Precisely. Spray a population, the few individuals with natural tolerance survive, they breed, and boom, the next generation is harder to kill. She mentioned an entomologist asking about resistance way back, but said DDT really kicked off the modern age of resistance.
How fast did it happen?
Astonishingly fast. Before 1945, maybe a dozen resistant species known worldwide. By 1960, 137 species. And growing, it became a huge global problem, especially for public health disease vectors like mosquitoes, lice, flies becoming resistant.
Threatening malaria control, for example.
Exactly. The WHO was deeply concerned. She quoted Dr. Elton again, hearing the rumblings of an avalanche. Examples poured in. Houseflies globally, body lice, mosquitoes everywhere, the plague-carrying rat flea. Florida Keys, mosquitoes becoming resistant to one chemical after another, leading to fantastically abundant flies you just couldn't control.
And it happened elsewhere, too.
Sardinia, Egypt DDT worked for a bit, then failed. They switched to BHC. That worked for a bit, then failed too. The flies came back stronger, and tragically, infant mortality rates climbed again. It was a losing battle. She quoted Dr. Brugere warning we were on a dangerous road and needed biological solutions working with nature, not against it. Humility was needed.
Which leads perfectly into the final main part, the other half of the circle, the alternatives. This must have been the hopeful part of the book.
It really was. She wanted to show there were other ways, smarter ways, based on understanding life biotic controls, she called them, using biology itself. She highlighted lots of different approaches being developed by various specialists.
Like what?
Insect sterilization was one. Dr. Knipling's famous work with the screwworm fly, releasing sterilized males to mate with wild females, causing the population to crash. Hugely successful in eradicating it from large areas.
Using radiation.
Mostly, yes. Though she also mentioned promising research on chemical chemosterilants. They'd shown success in trials with houseflies. Maybe you put them in bait. The insects would basically sterilize themselves. A very different concept than just killing them.
More targeted approaches, too.
Yes, like insect attractants. Pheromones, baits. The gypsy moth sex attractant was a great example. Scientists painstakingly figured out its chemical structure, synthesized it, and used it in traps. Huge progress was being made on lures for other pests, too.
Could you combine lures with poisons?
Yes, the male annihilation technique. Use an attractant to draw males to a tiny bit of poison. Tried successfully with fruit flies on Pacific Islands. Much less poison used, targeted, breaks down quickly. Way better than blanket spraying.
And using living organisms against pests. Biological control.
Absolutely, that was a huge focus. Things like milky disease, a natural bacterium used for decades against Japanese beetles in the eastern U.S. Very effective.
Any others?
Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT. Another bacterium produces a toxin lethal only to certain insect larvae, like caterpillars. Doesn't harm beneficial insects, birds, fish, us. Stops pests feeding quickly. It was being tested worldwide against all sorts of pests. Potential to replace things like dieldrin without the side effects or resistance problems.
And introducing natural enemies.
Classic biological control. Find predators or parasites from the pest's native home and bring them over. The textbook case is the Vidalia beetle saving California citrus from the cottony cushion scale back in the 1880s. Saved an industry. Many other successes followed: wasps for apple pests, enemies for alfalfa aphids, gypsy moths, Japanese beetles. California especially had saved billions through biocontrol.
Any other innovative ideas?
She mentioned work in Europe using forest red ants as predators, even cultivating colonies. And Dr. Repertofen's work with spiders in forests, recognizing their huge role as predators, even figuring out how to distribute egg sacs to boost populations. Young spiders protecting new tree growth. Just fascinating, creative ways of working with the ecosystem. Her point was, this whole vogue for poisons had blinded us to these smarter, more sustainable, ecological approaches.
So, wrapping up our deep dive into silent spring, the main messages seem crystal clear, even all these years later.
Absolutely. Carson just masterfully showed how interconnected life is and how blindly using these powerful chemicals had these far-reaching, devastating effects. Silent springs, human health risks, insects evolving resistance. It's all linked.
And hopefully for you listening, the aha moment is seeing the science she marshaled, even back then, to reveal these hidden dangers, but also crucially seeing that she offered hope too, right? Pointing towards alternatives.
Exactly. It wasn't just doom and gloom. She showed there was another path, based on biology and ecology.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you. Considering everything Carson laid out decades ago, what's our responsibility now? How do we push for these more sustainable, biologically based ways of managing things?
And on a personal level, maybe what small changes can you make? Choices about what you buy, what you support, how you manage your own little patch of the world. Could those small things add up to a bigger shift?
Something to think about. We definitely encourage you to explore these ideas further. It's about understanding that intricate, vital web of life all around us.